Welcome to our November meetup from Automation Advocates. Today I have a pretty cool guest, Almantas. I won't butcher his last name, and I won't make a lot of introduction here, but I want to say he's a software engineering team lead at AOG Aviation. Also has a lot of decorations already. For example, a Microsoft MVP 2 times or 3 times. I think 3 times it was in the slides. And gives workshops, talks, and everything. And today we'll talk about BDD. And I'm very happy that you're here, Amantas. And without further ado, I will give the spotlight to you and start my sketchnoting.
So this presentation is about BDD methodology, and the emphasis will be put on trying to clarify that BDD is more than just writing gherkin and automation and writing glue code for that gherkin. It's more than that. So this presentation will be on what really BDD is and how can you use it to help with collaborating within your company, to help you write really good tests and to detect bugs before you even start testing. So we'll have lots of examples, bust some myths about BDD, and it will be based, there will be an example website that I've tested. I don't know if I'll have to go the time to go through the code in it, but if you want to see how it's done in practice, I've tested this shopping cart page using BDD methodology, or to be precise, this functionality that when you change quantity, the other parts of the page are updated. So this particular functionality I've tested in BDD style. Okay, so this presentation is based on a few sources. So my own experience first and foremost. I've worked on several enterprise projects throughout the years. I've started test automation, even though I'm a software engineer. I've been into automated tests for 5 years now. And this presentation will be based on my own experience across several enterprise level projects. Then there are 2 really good books that I recommend reading that I base this presentation on. So it's BDD books, Discovery and Formulation. And there is a nice set of documentation as well as best practices for BDD in specflow.org website. This is the .NET framework for doing gherkin-based tests. So what is BDD? To quickly remind you, it's a way to define tests in a human-readable way. And when you define tests in this human-readable way, you can start thinking about just using those tests as documentation, as just examples of how to use your product, as a way to communicate the intent better. So you can basically involve more than just technical people in testing. You can involve also business people and even give this to the customer if you want. So BDD, or a feature in BDD, is like a test suite, and a scenario is like a test case. And it has a very simple structure. It's basically based on 3 key keywords. It's given, when, then. So given is a precondition, when is you interacting with a test system and the test, and then is what your assertion is. And to implement this, you're basically binding your gherkin. So for example, this given statement to a, like you translate that English statement into the underlying code behind by using regex expressions. So this basically means that this statement binds to this function. So when I call this, actually this code behind will be called. And And it's not hard to generate those, though it may look intimidating at the start and complicated. If you write gherkin, right-click, and you can just generate those bindings. Like, it has a decent prediction guessing system of what the code behind should be, at least the skeleton code behind. So it's not that difficult. So you have human readable code that binds to code behind, and it binds through regular expressions. A feature in BDD should be examples driven. So it's not just a tool for automation, it is documentation. And since it's tests, it has potential to be automated tests. You basically have documentation that's tested, and therefore you can trust that documentation because it's always in sync with tests, in sync with code. So often documentation is outdated, and at some point it may even better to not have any documentation than documentation that lies. But with BDD, you basically have documentation that you can trust because it's tested. However, at least from my experience, quite often you may find features or gherkin-based tests that are technical, with many test cases in one scenario. And gherkin, I often find that the language is just a tool for automation. And at worst scenarios, I see testers writing gherkin and developers code behind. And it shouldn't really be this way. So how to improve this issue? And before we start, today we will talk about behavior-driven development, BDD, from 3 perspectives. We will talk about it as a way to discover requirements, as a way to formulate specification, and as a way to automate, write automated tests. So it's 3 things. BDD is based on these 3 pillars: discovery, formulation, and automation. And I would say that the first 2 are much more important than the third one, because they prevent bugs as early as your requirements. So how do you make the most use of BDD in your daily lives, in your collaboration as you develop? First of all, BDD goes well with TDD. It's not the same. So TDD is like slightly lower level, slightly lower scope. It applies to unit tests mostly. And BDD applies more to requirements at a higher level, at the feature level usually. So the flow could be like this. You start with requirements. As you refine the story, you come up with examples, not in gherkin, but just some examples. And then immediately after the story is refined, you go and write a little bit of specification using gherkin language. And after you're done writing that specification, if possible, ideally add some glue code as well, run the tests, and you'll see that those tests are failing because there is no functionality yet implemented for that specification. And then a developer will pick up his end, will start implementing the source code part of functionality, not the test, but the source code, and they will start from a unit test. So their unit test will initially fail, then they will add some code, and then the test will pass. They'll add more tests, they will pass, and then finally they will keep adding tests and implementing stuff until the feature tests also pass. So if they consider their functionality is done, they will run now not only their unit tests, but also the behavior tests. the ones written in Gherkin language. And if they haven't implemented it correctly based on those behavior tests, they will need to add, again, more unit tests, run unit tests, and check again whether behavior test now passes after more unit tests are added and more functionality is added. And after that is done, just double check whether the whole full suite tests are passing, and that's about it. So this is called a double loop of TDD and BDD, and I highly recommend to practice it. Let's start from the first pillar, which is discovery, or in other words, how do you refine stories in a collaborative, clear way? Because from my experience, user stories is the first place where you can make bugs and requirements. So how do you present theory and principles in the most simple, easy way possible? And that's the question to you guys. Would anyone like to answer? I don't know if anyone has rights to talk or raise hands, don't know the process. I guess you could raise a hand.
You can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself.
So how to present theory in the most simple possible way, in the most easy to understand way. All right, so I will reveal the answer. I don't see anyone raising hands, if I'm not mistaken.
Example.
Yes, give an example. Yes, that's correct. So that's the easiest way. So theory is easiest understood by giving examples of practical application. And so an unrefined story should be supplemented not only with an acceptance criteria, but also with some examples, or acceptance criteria could be written in a form of examples. And if you do that, you basically leave no room for interpretation, and you involve the whole team as you refine to brainstorm, to put themselves into the shoes of customers, or at least the ones who use that functionality that you're implementing. And that really brings new insight to the table. When refining a user story, beware not to put technical details. Sometimes they are good, but only, like from my experience, if a team is very junior, if there aren't many senior people around, then refining in a technical way might be the only way, because the team still lacks experience to improvise, to give their input. Actually, the seniority doesn't have much to do with it. It's more about whether people feel comfortable talking about, like, just simply stating their mind. That's the main thing when refining stories, and it tends to come with experience, but it also may just tend to be based on personality, or based on how much knowledge do you have on the domain you're working on. But anyways, technically refined user stories are not ideal because you may be doing the wrong thing. For example, in this case, there is a button, like there are two buttons, like your acceptance criteria, instead of saying that you're supposed to just increase or decrease item quantity, you're saying that there has to be a button, one button to increase, one button to decrease, and then some text box to change quantity directly. But what if someone decides to make a slider for this functionality? By saying it should be a button, you take that freedom away from them. So be careful by not being too technical. And the worst kind of thing that I personally faced was when when we had a user story that went like this, and it was like we should support removing or updating all the accounts of a user so that they can refresh their data periodically. So, for example, if based on the latest data, an account is deleted of that user, then we also need to delete it on our end. And if the data, the account data is updated, we need to update that account as well on our end. And it was refined like this initially, like create 2 endpoints to delete and to put, like, so to delete and to update. When you refine it like this, again, you take freedom away, you start implementing, and you end up realizing that not only it's extra effort and it's more difficult to implement, but also that like you misunderstood the whole concept. And in this case, the whole concept was that we don't really want to create, to delete, to update. We simply want to override whatever data was with the latest. So if let's say we used a blob storage and a user account's data was in a blob storage, all you want to do is to discard entirely all that there was and replace it with the latest. And this was the functionality we chose, but we chose it later after implementing this because we refined it in a technical way. So if you refine a non-technical way, it unlocks you to think in a broader sense and potentially come up with a more optimal solution. So technical details are useful, but don't make them an acceptance criteria. Try to make it more like a comment, just a note for you to consider, but not a detail that you absolutely must implement. I've seen teams defining acceptance criteria in Gherkin language, and it actually worked pretty well. But there is a significant drawback by doing this. Does anyone have any idea what the drawback could be in this example? If you were to define stories in this way, and acceptance criteria in this way in Gherkin language?
Well, my experience is that nobody knows how.
Yes, and it's a fair point. So essentially, it limits freedom. It increases difficulty. Like it makes the refinement slightly more complicated than it should be. You're essentially writing tests in a refinement if you are writing Gherkin in acceptance criteria. So examples are needed, but they shouldn't be like it doesn't have to be defined in the Gherkin language. So Gherkin is still code. It takes time to think how to make it readable, what scenarios should there be, whether scenarios are redundant or not. And that's not what the refinement is for. So instead, think of fast, easy to write examples. Don't care about the format. Whatever you think is convenient, just write it down. So essentially what I wrote in here is now written in a more simple format. There is no gherkin here, but these are still examples, and these are still in some way based on those 3 steps. What's the precondition? What do you do? What do you expect? But there is no like formal structure to these. It's just whatever is convenient. So fast, easy to understand examples, and sometimes you may need more than 1 example per acceptance criteria, sometimes not. But having an example, at least 1 per each, you will make it a lot more clear in what is actually required. And you may think that this takes a long time, but think how long it takes to figure out what is actually needed for a story that wasn't refined properly. This is a good effort put into figuring out what's really needed and to actually challenging what, let's say, the product owner had in mind, because you're trying to ask for examples and the whole team is coming up with examples and others are verifying those. So it's a very valuable thing to do because you avoid miscommunication. You don't avoid it completely, but it's significantly reduced. So by putting examples in user stories, you make them significantly more interesting, down to earth, and people are involved. Don't use gherkin in those examples. Just make them minimalistic. And like this, you will help with discovering what you may have not considered in a user story. And it also lays out a good basis for you to take those examples and formulate test scenarios out of them. So when writing examples, focus on a single rule. Don't make too many redundant examples. Just one example, one rule, one example, one acceptance criteria. And like this, we prevent bugs before even writing a test. And now that we have some requirements, we can start writing tests. What do you think is wrong with this scenario? What comes to your mind? What you wouldn't like as someone who is implementing increase item quantity scenario for a single item? Is there anything that's like that you frown upon in this code?
We need the URL.
Sorry, what?
We didn't need the URL.
Yes. What else?
I think the test will not age well with the Samsung Galaxy A5.
Yes. So there are many details, and if I don't know if you like read the test and started raising questions. Why is it Samsung Galaxy? Why is it this specific website? What if the button changes, and what is item quantity text box like? If you start asking questions, then that means that your test is not perfect. So, for example, unless this detail is an absolutely important detail, like an absolute must, then you shouldn't really put that specifics into the test scenario. So in this case, I don't really care about the specific item I have in the cart. I only care that there is an item. Also, don't care about the URL because it may change, and actually it's a demo page, so in production it will be different. And the button, we already talked, it may be something else. I just want the concept that somehow I change the quantity. So what happens if I change it? I can change it by clicking a button. I can change it by editing directly the text box for it, or I can change this through a slider, or however it's implemented. But if I fixate myself to just this, I'm not future-proof. And lastly, this item quantity text box, though it's somewhat clear, it's still technical. It's maybe an item ID actually. And again, if that changes, not only will I have to change my glue code, potentially, but I'll also have to change the gherkin as well. But my gherkin should be isolated, like the main thing that I should protect from the changes as the requirements change. Sorry, as requirements remain the same, but the technical details change, my gherkin should remain the same. And this "to" in quotes is also not great, because it is like, we don't think about numbers as text. It's a number, so it's not text, it's a number. So it shouldn't be in quotes, and that word text is unnecessary. So a little bit refactored, it looks like this. All right. And so no longer a specific item, no longer a specific query, no longer a specific way of incrementing quantity, and no longer technical details in the expectation. Not all state needs to be explicit. And coming back to this one, what do you think, like, what could you imply when testing a shopping cart page, the item quantity change in the shopping cart page? What detail could you imply? Like, what's redundant, maybe a little bit? So I have a suggestion. As a tester, would you be going to a shopping cart page every time you're testing a different scenario? For example, would you re-navigate the shopping cart page if you're testing increment or decrement of a quantity? Or could we imply that we are in the shopping cart page as we are focused on testing different behaviors of incrementing and decrementing? So in this case, you don't really need to, like, you can really imply that you are in that page. So it doesn't have to be repeated every time you write a scenario. So we can move it. It's a detail that not only you need to put somewhere, but it can be implied completely in your glue code. So you just write the glue code, so in this special way that this detail is implied. However, other details should be a little bit more explicit. So here I put the shopping cart contains a product. That's an important detail. If we didn't have a product initially in our shopping cart, our test wouldn't work. Like if we are increasing or decreasing quantity, it needs to be quantity of something. So now by putting that in the background, we say, okay, there's a product. So we are decreasing and reducing quantity, decreasing quantity of that product that is in the shopping cart. So details that are not very important, that we, or rather that we don't want to repeat, but are somewhat important, we can put in the background, like in here. In Gherkin, you can parameterize tests using examples table, like this. So it doesn't actually have to be a ton of examples. It could be a single example that you could put through this table as well. And it will be just replaced by those quotes. But my question to you guys is, are all examples in here needed? Do you find it redundant? And here's the formula on the left, how the cost is calculated. It's actually not very clear how it's truly calculated, but there are hints of at least boundary values for like what's the maximum cost per week, per day, per hour. So if you were a QA in this who is responsible for this test, would you remove some of the examples in here?
I want to remove the ones going past boundary
Yes.
levels.
So it's a good shout. So basically, if we pay nine euros after 5 hours and the same price after 9, it's probably not needed, at least the 24 hours one, because it shows that it doesn't change the price, and the price starts increasing only after hitting another day. and then whether it's 3 hours or 5 hours, it also doesn't really matter. We proved that already by this one already, so it's fine, but we care about boundary values. So like it's enough to have just those two to prove a point, or maybe even one. It's debatable, but I would put two, keep two just in case, because it's more clear to see that increasing the time up to a point doesn't really change the price. And also, what's logically 0 minutes parking? It's not really possible, because if you are in a parking slot, you are parking. So 0 minute, even though technically you can put 0 in it, it's not a possible scenario. So it always has to be more than 0. So this can be removed. And each of the boundary values, like the last one, also can be removed. And these 3 and 5 hours can also be removed. And then 3 weeks or 1 week. 3 weeks is a bit, I suppose, trickier. Like, why is it 3? It could be just a bit more simple. So just 2 weeks.
Sorry to interrupt. I would add tests for German time savings, because maybe there would be negative durations.
For example, what would be the duration?
I don't know, negative 1 hour, 30 minutes, because from, I don't know, from jumping from summer to winter time in Germany, 2 a.m. in the morning exists twice. So you can end the exit the parking garage before you enter. Kind of.
Okay, that's really cool. I didn't think of that one. Yes, you could add that as well. And to justify your like why a specific scenario was chosen, it's often useful to put a description, like just by looking at values, a combination of values chosen. It may not be that straightforward to understand why that combination is chosen, but in tests there is a hack. In Gherkin, for example, you can use a new column called description, or whatever you call it. It doesn't matter how you call it, and it basically gives you some space to clarify the reason, like consider it a comment why a certain value was chosen. And it's better than a comment because you can functionally use it in the description. It also gives you some nice formatting. You don't have to use this value, and it's actually usually not used, but it certainly helps with understanding what is meant by a combination of values. And if you talk about integration or unit tests, you can use a because argument. Many of the frameworks support that. So just justify why are you expecting a certain thing? Why are you passing a certain argument? Sometimes it may be difficult to spot the parameter. In this case, there is a test that checks what happens if there is an extra or a missing item in the inventory. So when auditor performs audit, if there is a missing item, we want to alert the supplier, hey, you didn't give us enough inventory. But if there is an extra one, we're kind of happy and we do not need to alert it. It's not like great for them, it's great for us, but we don't want to notify them. It's fine. So what's the argument here? Is it one? Is it one missing? Is it missing? What's the thing that impacts the test? The key thing impacting? So I think, like, reviewing this again, I would say that one is not a very relevant detail, so it could be just missing or extra is what actually is the thing that changes the outcome. So not one, it's just missing an extra. But the point is slightly elsewhere. The point is, how do you put emphasis on the argument so that it's not mixed with other things and that it's clear immediately? So you can put the argument at the end, or you can put it in quotes and you make it clear that way. Also, it will be significantly easier to parse if you put it in quotes or at the end. And if you want to read more, there is a link, a reference. In Gherkin, you can also have multi-line expectations. So like if you have a JSON, you can put a JSON in between 3 single quotes. You can use same placeholders. If you had, so instead of this one, it could be a placeholder. And then through examples table, it would be replaced. So same works. And this is what I meant. For example, you want to check whether you can get a user. So the existing user ID in here, as well as in here, will be replaced based on the existing user ID in the examples table, 1 and 2. And of course, when you think about validation, sometimes validation may look like this. For example, you have a really long string and you want to just make it clear that that this is indeed a string over 25 symbols long, or this one is over 30 symbols long. And then you can count one by one. Is it really like this or not? Did you actually cover it or not? And this is okay-ish, but what if it's 100 symbols long? Will you write a really long string and expect someone to count to 100? No. You should come up with something more simple. So in the beauty of Gherkin and its frameworks is that you can be creative and come up with your own syntax and your own ways of working. So in this case, in my previous workplace, I've created a token called text. And after this token, you can specify how long of a text you want to be generated. So in this case, if I say text 26, which is one more than 25, I trust this code will generate me a random string that's 26 characters long. Same with this one. And like this, I no longer need to like count individual characters in the string. I can simply look immediately and understand that, okay, it will be indeed 26 long. So you can clarify things in this way. And there was a question, should you be creating multiple like scenarios for like break this down into 2 scenarios, one for name, one for surname, just to test whether text is over the max limit? And the answer is no, because when you think about testing, you are supposed to test one thing, but one thing doesn't mean necessarily a single property. It simply means a single logical thing. And in this case, logical thing can be interpreted as a rule for maximum length. And since validation usually works in that it validates everything at the same time, when you feed into an API, for example, you don't really have to break it down. You don't really benefit from that at all, because here is the input and input for validating a single rule, and here are the errors in case it fails. So the same error for the same rule, slightly different because it's slightly different fields. But the point remains, you still tested it. This test is still easy. It's still easy to understand. It's simple, and it has enough, not more than what you expect. There are other fields in this test, like status code, trace ID, and title, fields that you probably covered in other tests. So if it doesn't matter, don't include them. So here's how this test should be like after it's refactored. You don't include the details that you don't care about. So you can, again, write some glue code that just checks whether the response body contains this, or there are different ways how you can implement. You can use regular expressions and check line by line. You can do string contains, or you can deserialize this and compare the response object with this deserialized object. So do not force reader to care about irrelevant details. I think like an asterisk can make code more readable, and here is how. If you have multiple assertions or like specification for the previous thing, previous step, you can like put emphasis for that detail, that this is indeed a detail of the previous thing. So for example, I have a response and its details are body and status code. So I can put an asterisk and like this, put emphasis that both of those with body and status code, it refers the response body and not, for example, the request body. This isn't a convention that people use. It's something that you can come up with in your own team and use. So it's a useful way. So asterisk in this sense can serve as a given, as a when, or as a then keyword. You can replace all of them with an asterisk. And it's also useful for listing. For example, in this case, given inventory report contains 1 damaged trace, and you repeat, what does your inventory contain? You can simplify it by using an asterisk as well. So it's also great for listing items. Let's move on. A simple word as a but is also something that you can consider. So here, consider that there was some registration process which failed because the request was invalid. And then you read the expectation as such. So then a registration entry should be created. So there's some auditing done. And the user should not be created. So when something happened and something didn't happen, if you combine the opposing events with an end word, it's quite confusing. However, if you use a but word, it has a whole different meaning to your brain, because you see there is a contrast between something that happened and something that didn't happen. So if I change it like this, it's much easier to read. So registration entry should be created, but the user should not be registered. Now it's much easier to read. And at the start, I showed scenarios where there are many thens and whens, and you should really avoid those scenarios. But some scenarios may illustrate a typical behavior of a user. And that's quite a useful thing. So a scenario may show like what a typical user in a shop does. They browse a few items, they go check them out, they realize they want to increase the quantity of one item, so you automate that as well. And then they go through the whole checkout process. And this is called a journey of a typical user. And you can have personas for your users and illustrate their behavior through different journeys for those users. But a journey should be limited to just like 1 or 2. Don't add too many journeys, just because they are complex tests. They're not really the best tests, but they are documentation of a typical behavior that your users show. So consider them. When creating automated tests, when formulating those scenarios, focus on readability and use simple test data. By simple, I mean you shouldn't require a person to grab a calculator to just figure out what you meant. When scenarios are similar, parameterize them, and for God's sake, don't introduce details that don't matter. And there is an example, but we are running out of time, so I'll give a link for that example from the browser. Because it's a pretty good one. This one. All right. And I'll put it in the chat. Here we go. And from here, I'll just cover some really key points that may not be straightforward. One is that I've seen people organizing their glue code by semantics. So I've seen people using arrange, act, and assert folders. Do not do that, because you basically will have many steps that really screams of being together, but you're separating them in 3 parts. For example, if I have change product quantity steps, then if I have changed product quantity, if I want to do something with changing product quantity, then everything like the assertions for product quantity, how I change product quantity, and what state should it have initially, all those things, it should be in the same place, because it's all about the same thing. When you reason about things, you should reason about a logical domain object rather than a semantical piece of your test. So logical domain object is changing product quantity. So all about it should be in the same class, in the same place. Otherwise, you will end up changing many places. You will require to access some global context to get the data you need, the context you need. But when it's all in one class for that domain object, then, for example, all I need is a shopping cart page to interact with the product quantity steps. So it's all there. It's all in one place. But if you scatter it through arrange, act, assert parts, it will be very confusing. I'm not saying to write all code in one class, but I'm saying to organize it per domain objects. So here is how it looked like on my end. I had stock steps, and I had a bunch of, like, for inventory domain, and for shopping cart page, I had a bunch of things that you can do in the shopping cart page. Like, you can add a product to a shopping cart, you can change product quantity, you can check the display, like what's the totals, etc. And you can check validation as well. So each of those are distinct domain responsibilities, but arrange, act, and assert steps, if needed, are all in those. There is no segregation between arrange, act, and assert. So that's quite an important thing. So I will not talk about hooks because hooks are quite simple. It's not very important for you to know. And yes, to summarize, BDD is a methodology for collaborative development, and it's used the key point there is examples and user stories, which reduce the risk of bugs even before we start developing or writing tests. So it's very useful. It's the methodology that brings developers, testers, and business people together. So it's a great way to collaborate. BDD and TDD go hand in hand because both put emphasis on writing tests before code. And scenarios aren't just automation, they are also documentation. By having automation in our documentation, we can trust it because it's always in sync with code. It proves that our tests, that our documentation works, that it's not outdated. And like this, we can trust in those examples and those scenarios. So that's why BDD really shines and helps. That's really all I had to talk about. And if you want to learn more, here is some references. There is a BDD blog by Baskarnagi, and then there are 4 books. And actually, that's a definitive list. There isn't more about BDD. There's literally just those 4 books, plus some blog posts. So if you're into it, it doesn't really take a long time to go through all the material that's out there. But if you do, if you practice, if you learn, if you observe it, it will definitely help you to be a better tester. So thank you for your attention. Here's the demo link. And if you want to contact me, you can through email or LinkedIn.